So, welcome everybody. I have spent the day trying to figure out how to streamline all of this information without knowing exactly where I'm headed. So, I have a very strong mission right now to clarify so much of the debris around understanding ADHD, also the debris around coaching. Some of you have heard me talk a lot about how, like every single thing in the world, there are really great benefits and beautiful parts about coaching generally, NLP coaching specifically. And then there are areas that are less useful than maybe they're projected to be, or a little muddier, or not as definitive or certain as we often want them to be. And so between not really understanding neurodivergence and ADHD specifically, and people not really understanding what's possible in coaching and NLP coaching specifically, I think that there's a really important area here to cover in this field, like in this area of focus, because there's obviously a tremendous amount of need out there because it's getting so much attention, right? So the fact that a meme, say, like somebody takes a little piece of actual evidence, right? So you'll see something that says, if you lose your keys every day, it's not your fault. You might have ADHD or something like that, right? And then it's like a whole thing about how if you lose your keys, it probably means you have ADHD, which is really taking advantage of what I call this sort of like soft, mushy, confidently expressed feeling that makes you feel seen and it makes you feel understood sometimes and not alone, and all of those emotional things, which are good, but it doesn't do anything to help you. It doesn't actually provide anything helpful, mostly because there's nothing behind it. It's just grabbing the top layer of this stuff and making everyone feel really good because they can connect to the idea and the feeling of that, but everyone's feeling their own feelings around it. And what I really want to do here, both in my practice here with you guys in these free talks, eventually in a paid program that I intend to put together and really work with coaches on what we can change, what we can't change. I keep saying that neurodiversity as opposed to just ADHD. I am starting with ADHD, A, because I think it's probably one of the most prevalent ones, B, because I just recently got diagnosed, and C, because it's fascinating. But neurodivergence generally is something that is every aspect of it is very confusing because we're comparing it to something that we're calling neurotypical, which doesn't exist, right? There isn't actually such a thing as neurotypical because what in the heck would that be? That would be like a baby born into a void of perfection. Never gets affected by conditioning, never gets affected by trauma, or never gets bullied, never has beliefs that are false beliefs. You know what I mean? We don't actually have a neurotypical to compare it to, but we do have a neurotypical way of responding to fear, say, right? If 1,000 people are in an environment and they drop a big old spider in or something like that, what they call neurotypical is going to be the way that whatever percentage, the majority of those people respond. So they're going to say, oh, they see the visual stimuli, they experience threat, they back away, they are in a fear response for approximately 3 minutes before they realize that they're safe. Then the system calms down. There will be this way of describing what is typical, and then they just call that typical. And, I don't think there's a better way for us to do it yet. It makes sense to me. I'm not offended by the fact that this is what we refer to as normal or typical, because where else can we gather the data? Other than we have to all acknowledge that there's a tremendous amount of conditioning that goes into what today we're calling normal, right? So every time we look for research, the best research out there on what is the brain actually doing, what are we calling ADHD, what's happening inside the brain, how are we differentiating it from normal, what is exclusive to ADHD, what is something that is just typical of someone who has these other patterns. But Research is all biased. Research would tell you that girls are naturally kinder than boys. But you can only do that study with girls who have been conditioned by our current society. So they call something objective research or evidence-based or proven or whatever, as if it's nature when really it's conditioning. So there is no way to actually measure that yet because no one lives in the absence of these things. So it's a tricky place to navigate because we're all, I think, just trying to understand our own experience, and comparison is literally the only way we can do that. The only way that we can define anything is by defining what it's not. And without getting into the quantum of that, it really is true. The only reason you know what a chair is, for real, if we broke it down, and we're not going to do that tonight, but the only reason you know what the chair is only because you actually know what a chair isn't. And so by deduction, you know what a chair is. That's how the logic works. And we're trying to define something by really shifting what it's not, what it is, how we compare it to certain things. And what I feel like I'm called to do right now, because of the way my brain works, not the ADHD part of my brain, just the Tara part of my brain, I tend to get really frustrated when things are stated as if they're truths because they make us feel good, but they're not actually truths, and it pisses me off. So here's where I want to begin today. I've done something good. I think that you will appreciate how I've brought this together. I've taken 4 things, and I really believe this, that looking through this lens as coaches, that we can do such good work when we understand things this way. So the shape is that I've taken 4 aspects of ADHD. So neurotypical would do something different than what these 4 things do in the ADHD brain normally, right? And of course, with everything else we discovered last time, I'm going to talk about time first, which has come up every time so far. But it is actually different from the way a neurotypical brain experiences time. I'm going to try to explain it to you in a really rudimentary, comprehensive way so that you can understand what's actually happening, like why I can definitively actually say the brain does it differently in the ADHD brain from a typical brain. And then I want to talk about the emotions associated to these 4 things. These are just 4 of many. But that way, we're going to be able to look at both the function, like the operation and function of the brain and what's happening to make it ADHD-ish. And then we can look at the emotional aspect, which is the intangible. So the tangible needs to be there to meet the criteria of being legitimately something that goes along with this type of neurology. And then the emotional part, it really can't be measured. We just don't have good ways of measuring emotion. We can watch the amygdala, we can see how things fire, we can measure vibrational frequencies, but we don't actually have a really good way of understanding. We can't yet look at a person and say they're feeling sadness about their grandmother who used to, we can't read that stuff in the MRI. But we know for sure that it's a felt experience. We can't, even though we can't measure love, we can't measure sadness, we can't measure any of those things. We also, as human beings, know that it is absolutely a truth that we experience them. And it's safe to say that if you love your dog and your dog dies, you're probably going to feel sadness. I would say that's probably a pretty universal experience. And so those 2 things, the tangible and the intangible, I think if you're coaching somebody and if you're promising somebody that you're going to help support them through something like neurodiversity, you've got to understand both of those things. You must actually understand, like really get it, and not just lean on one or lean on the other because they're both equally relevant. So the first one, this first face, if we were to call it like one of the faces of ADHD, is this time thing. So the time thing. So essentially, here's what's going on. There are 3 regions of the brain that inform us about time. So there is the frontal cortex, this part of the brain that actually knows time is passing. So this is the part of our brain that learns about time, essentially. So when you're very young, you start to learn conceptually that there is a now and there's a later, there's a before and there's an after, there's that time is linear, that sort of thing. And that's all happening in this frontal cortex. And so that has to work in tandem with the striatum. And this is the dopamine clock. So this is actually the dopamine has to infuse this clock. And this is like the metronome. So this needs dopamine for it to actually stay steady. It is fairly proven that we know that we actually have a distortion in time, right? When you're having the time of your life, it doesn't just seem like time is moving faster. You experience it. And when you're having a really difficult time or a challenging time or something is hurting you or something is hard or whatever, time actually is experienced as slower. And so we all, to a certain degree, have everyone, neurotypical, neurodivergent, everything. The striatum is actually affected by the environment and by what inputs are going into the brain, into the sensory system. But it's dopamine charged. So for the ADHD brain, it's very dysregulated. The third thing is the cerebellum. And the cerebellum, which is the back part, that's the split-second rhythm. So the cerebellum is actually the part of your brain that catches a ball. So this is the part that can measure if something gets thrown at me. It's actually astonishing when we think about the reality of this, with a ball coming at us at however many kilometers an hour, and we know when to put our hand up, that we actually know how to do that, right? It's nearly impossible to imagine that our brains can choreograph down to the split second when the timing of having to operate our bodies and driving cars and all that kind of stuff, how that happens. That's the cerebellum. But it's this striatum, this dopamine infused metronome. That's the thing that doesn't work evenly. And so it collapses time. And the frontal cortex, of course, operates sometimes and not other times. So the frontal cortex is the one that, like, when we're really engaged, when we're really excited, that's when it works really well. But when we're not engaged and when we're bored and when we're uninterested, it doesn't fire as well, it doesn't work as well. So these three parts of the brain all have to be working together in order for you to have what we would call a normal sense of time. And in the ADHD brain, we can see that the activity is not firing the same way as it does in a neurotypical brain. We also know that when people get medicated, so that there is a more even distribution of dopamine and there is more access to receiving it, people's experience of time gets more accurate when they're on medication, which really demonstrates, if you're looking for proof of the ADHD brain, in fact, mechanically is operating different, the fact that the medication straightens it out is pretty good evidence for that. So the way that I'm structuring all of this, and this is the part that's really important to coaches, because I don't think that we have the right to sit with somebody and say, if you just try harder, you can't try harder to make the striatum actually become a metronome when it's not, right? You can't do that in a sheer willpower. So I think the job for those of us who are actually going to try and help people, whether it's in a coaching scenario or whether it's in your own house with someone you love or yourself, is to understand that there are parts of this that you can change. And then there are parts of this that you have to accept. So you're going to do your client or your loved one or whatever so much good by being able to create those two distinctions, right? So in this case, you can change your external scaffolds around you. You can actually use things to make yourself more able to deal with time, right? So my clock that I keep talking about and obsessing about, that's helpful. You can have other ways of doing it. There's a million different ways, right? All you would have to do is go and find different ways to use alarms or a million different systems. The thing you've got to accept first is that you're not going to internalize a neurotypical clock by willpower. So if you're not willing to accept that, then you're not likely to be able to actually embrace those things that are going to allow you to create change. So this is true of everything. First, you accept where you are, and rather than feeling like it's a limitation, because my brain is never going to experience time the way somebody else's brain is, if I just stay there, then yeah, of course that's a limitation. And if I try to use it as an excuse, it's an excuse-making limitation. But if I just accept that, then I can accept where I am on the map and decide how I'm going to change it. So I think, again, as a coach, your job would be to work with, here's what you got to accept, here's what you can change, decide where you want to go with this, right? And maybe you don't give a shit. Maybe you have a job and a lifestyle where you don't need to worry about time, and so you just accept it and carry on with your happy life. God bless. So the second one is this focus in the screensaver. So I mentioned this last time, but again, I have a deeper understanding of it now, and I've actually been practicing working with it a little bit because it's fast. It is like fascinating to me how this works. So once I stopped obsessing about the time, I got on to this focus screensaver thing. So this is very much, there's two networks. Okay, so there's two neural networks that our brains function with. One is this default mode, right? And the other is like a task positive one. It's the one that we actually get in gear when we have to do something. So normally what's happening in what we would call the neurotypical, remember the explanation, some of you missed my explanation in the beginning, but it'll make sense to you as we go. That one goes on, the other goes off. One goes on, the other goes off. In the ADHD brain, we actually see, I now have seen the research, I have seen the brain scans. It's super, super leaky. It's like the impulses aren't strong enough. So the default, like the screensaver, never quite goes off. So it's like you have a haze of it in the background all of the time. And the task positive one comes on, but it actually is like spotty. Like it just doesn't have the strength, the neural strength of a neurotypical mind until it's infused with like massive hits of dopamine, right? So this is urgency, this is excitement, this is like total passion, physical movement. Like when you're actually dancing on the stage, you can stay focused dancing on the stage. Physical movement is a huge one. This is probably why a lot of people with ADHD get into really physical works. Amazingly, interestingly for me, also when you have rhythmic things going on. So I've been talking to you guys, I think, a little bit about like how I started running when I turned 40 and I started getting hit with all the like craziness of life and kids and all this stuff, and suddenly I couldn't keep my shit together. I started running, and what I've learned now is that things that are rhythmic, physical and rhythmic, are really good for actually letting the brain have an experience of a task positive focus. And so it relieves the brain a little bit. Anyway, so because the charges are so slow, what happens is there's a constant, if there's a term that I ran into called, oh shit, I can't remember it. Mental, doesn't matter, it'll come to me. But it's like okay, I want to explain this in terms of returning a text. So I have a tendency, and loads of the people that I have spoken to now with ADHD will avoid returning a text. They'll also avoid actually meeting up with people. But the text thing is really interesting, and it has a lot to do with this background thing. So it's as if in the ADHD brain, it's like that background isn't just one screen. It's not just that there's one thing that's bleeding in. The background is as if you have 14 tabs open on your computer. So ADHD brains very rarely close tabs. Once something's open, it tends to stay open. So rather than this sort of, I think very commonly and stereotypically, we know that ADHD is really known for people not being able to finish things, starting things but not finishing them. And it's all these open tabs. So what's bleeding through this screensaver, this glow of the screensaver bleeding through, is not just one thing, but it's the 14 tabs that are open. So it makes it really hard to want to open new tabs when you know you can't close them. So they're getting opened all the time without you even realizing that you're opening them. My kid needs something, and then my pet needs something or whatever. Yeah, and if you close, Catherine has said, if you close the tabs, you'll forget what you were doing. So we keep all of these open. So something like a text, because we also tend to have this over-emotional response to things, if somebody sends a text, we're unlikely, it can sometimes cause a sense of crap. Because if you want to respond, but you want to respond well, and if you respond well, now you're going to maybe start a conversation, which you probably know that you don't really have time to necessarily complete, especially if you actually don't have time to complete it. But it also just takes a focus that is you're not sure how you're going to close that down. You're not sure how you're going to end it. And you also, again, with this emotional stuff with people with ADHD who tend to have an overcharged sense of empathy and of emotional responsibility for other people and all this kind of stuff, you're not going to feel good emotionally if you leave the conversation half-assed. And so you'll avoid the conversation because it's not just responding to a text. It's like you're opening a whole new thing that is just one more thing that you're likely going to have then bleeding in. And so this sort of avoidance behavior comes in and is really predominant when you have other stressors, right? So a lot of people, I experience it myself tons, and I know a bunch of you do, when you're really stressed, things like responding to a text or meeting a friend for lunch, because you don't really want, you'll use the excuse of you don't have time, but really what's happening is you actually don't have the emotional bandwidth. You know that you're going to be sitting there having lunch with your friend, but you're worried about being self-absorbed because you've still got all those 4,500 things running in the background that you know are going to bleed through. And so you're going to have a tough time staying really engaged where you are without that stuff coming through. And for a million different reasons, it makes it feel really like an emotional overload, even if the engagement itself isn't super emotional. It just means that your brain is gonna have to do something that is really difficult for your brain to do. So you can often get into these patterns of avoidance for things like that, and it all has to do with this screensaver just bleeding through. So, in terms of what you can change and what you need to accept, you've gotta accept that you have this leaky switch, that the bleed is going to happen. It's really, I haven't found anywhere so far anybody who has successfully figured out without medication. Medication does figure this out for you. But if you're not doing medication, I haven't seen any evidence that you can actually fix this leaky, bleeding screen thing. But you can change your strategy for how to stay focused. So these are the dopamine first things, right? So if you can get the dopamine charged high enough, then you can do it. Novelty. If you can introduce novelty in, you can usually create a much more reliable, opaque experience for yourself. Urgency can be fuel, interest, that sort of thing. I know with my friends, I'm embarrassed about it still, even knowing all this stuff, but I often say to them, I really don't like planning things a week ahead because I am just so sure that probably if I say I'm gonna meet somebody or do something a week from now, it feels like chaos to me. It just feels like, how in the world am I gonna know if that's gonna work out for me? Not realizing previously that because my life is oriented around urgency and bursts and all this kind of stuff, and because when I am emotionally unable to manage all this stuff, it's really tough to override the dread of not wanting to put yourself into an uncomfortable situation like that. So but I have a couple of friends who are willing to do this where I'll say, but I know if if it's 10 o'clock and I connect with you when I connect with you, and I'll just take my chances if you're free and if you're not. And no hard feelings. I will never expect you to drop anything for me, but I actually work a lot better that way. And I will have these times when I'll be like, holy shit, I've got 2 hours. Let's go have lunch or let's go for a walk. It's not a perfect, not even close to a perfect system of doing things, but this is probably also why a lot of ADHD people end up with ADHD friends. Because they really have filtered out the people that can't handle these sort of things tend to filter out of those lives, and the people who understand them and truly understand them get it because they're the same way. That one is really relevant, and you can see that it is tangible, and then all the emotions around it very intangible. Okay, halfway there. And then the working memory. This working memory thing is very interesting. I mentioned a little bit last time, but I didn't go into it. This idea of a shelf. But what I got hung up on was I've talked to a couple of people who have a very acute experience of not having working memory, who have ADHD or believe they have ADHD. And I don't share that same experience. As an adult, I've actually been pretty good at learning things and keeping them in my memory. I was trying to figure out how this all worked because, in terms of working memory, you're not going to be able to override this. You do have a smaller sort of tabletop to retain information than a neurotypical brain, So you sit here and maybe you've listened to what I've said, or you've listened to something else, and you understand all the information. You get it. You're very clever and you understand it all. But when you go to access it, the things have fallen off. There's too much there, and the things you're looking for have fallen off the tabletop, and they're not accessible to you. So it's not that you didn't understand them. It's not that you didn't. It's just that they're not available to you anymore. But what does happen and what does work is that, say there were like 45 things on the table. Okay. A bunch of it's going to fall off. But if you repeatedly set the same things on the table, so of those 45 things that are on the table, if you make 25 of those repeatedly, call it A's. So there's a whole bunch of A's and you just repeatedly keep putting it on the table. For example, you keep studying the same thing, the same technique, the same idea, the same ideas. And of those 45 things, you have 20 or 25 of them that are A's. And then the rest of them are like a couple of B's and a few C's and the odd D and E there. If a whole bunch of them are A's, your chances, just statistically, of them staying on the table, of being on the table when you're accessing the information is far greater. I studied NLP and then I immediately used it. I kept reading about it. I kept applying it to the knowledge that I already had. I had clients right away that I would try something with them, then I would think about it, then I would look it up. So if NLP was the A, or the information all in there, it kept coming onto my tabletop. So I wasn't experiencing this sort of working memory of things falling off because I kept just staying focused on it enough that it was repeatedly there until I actually know the information in an internalized way where it doesn't have to be on the tabletop. It's just available. It's unconscious knowing, right? This is when we get into that unconscious stuff that we don't have to access it. When you're driving the car, you don't have to remember about pressing the gas and going at a green light and all that kind of stuff. Is just internalized. And so if you can keep it on the table through really staying focused, it's going to become internalized. And in the meantime, you're actually going to have a lot of access to it. And that high frequency is almost always the key to people who have ADHD and other reasons. ADHD isn't the only reason you have a small working memory. There are other neurological things going on that cause people to have smaller working memories. But it's an incredibly useful way in terms of being able to help your clients or yourself or your loved ones. This is really a matter of discerning more than anything else. So really deciding what you want to be able to really keep in your memory, you probably have to do it at high repetition more so than other people. And it actually helps if it's stuff that you're really interested in because you've got that hyper focus. It will stay in your mind. And then the things that you don't really care about, this is where you just have to accept it. I am never, ever going to know the names of all the Blue Jays players, even though I watch loads of baseball games. That's never going to stay in there for me. I'm never really going to be able to know the lyrics to songs because they don't stay with me. And so I think you've got to really, but if it was something that was really relevant to me, I would have to go about it this way. I would have to actually decide that I was going to put it on high frequency and repetition and keep it on the table until it becomes internalized. I think that in terms of the emotions that go around this, those are much harder. The emotions associated with not having a good working memory are incredibly damaging to a person's self-esteem, as you can imagine, right? This is also one of those reasons why girls tend to get diagnosed far less than boys, because girls actually would have made an effort because of our conditioning around people pleasing and being a good student would have caused girls to be more likely to study, to pay attention, to repeatedly do things. A lot of people with ADHD are going to be the best at the things that they're interested in because of this. Those people who didn't find it young, who didn't actually care enough about those things or have an interest or a passion or a purpose enough to bring them into a repetitive way, were probably doing poorly. They probably weren't doing well at whatever, at school, academia, all of those sorts of things. So the emotions around this one are tough because there's going to be a lifetime, likely for a lot of people, where this is their lived experience, is they feel like they're incapable, not smart, all of that kind of stuff. The other thing that I think really works, and I'll say this very quickly, is that once you apply things, so the more I was once you apply 20 things and you connect them, you guys have all heard about brain, what's it called, where you build a castle in your brain? Like, you connect things so they become one instead of three, right? So one of the things that I know I did with my coaching practice and with NLP is being able to take information, and when you string it together, if you imagine a whole bunch of things on the tabletop and they're falling off, right? Independent things are falling off. If you can attach ideas and string them together, then they're not going to fall off as individual things, right? So if you can start connecting ideas. When I was learning quantum healing, I was able to connect those ideas to the timeline therapy that I already really knew very well. And I strung the ideas together. So when I was actually trying to take the pieces of quantum healing and fit them in, so long as I could connect them to things that I already knew that were internalized or very easy to bring out onto the table, then I didn't lose them as quickly. And so the more that you could help your clients or yourself actually string ideas together, if it's important to you to keep them on the table, to keep that working memory available, string them together. Just connect them to very familiar, concrete knowledge, and you'll find that they become more accessible to you. Okay, last one. So the last one is this concept of the amygdala going off before a thought. Rejection,
Sensitivity dysphoria.
rejection, sensitivity, dysphoria, which essentially is something that shows up frequently with people who have ADHD. And it is true that across the board, I have noticed this for sure with all of my clients who have ADHD. There's this really heightened response to rejection. But I have done this work for too long. And I also know that this is very common in people who don't have ADHD. Rejection sensitivity is just, I don't know, there's so many reasons why you can be so sensitive to rejection. And so this is what started me down this. I don't want to be going into rejection sensitivity stuff if it isn't actually necessarily exclusive to ADHD or even correlated well. And what I discovered today, just as I was putting this all together, was that there is, in fact, not a lot of evidence. There's no good measured studies that can actually connect ADHD to a heightened sense of rejection, except for clinical anecdotal experience that people tend to notice. There are some numbers. 80% of people who have ADHD also have abnormally high rejection sensitivity. But we can't see it. It's not in the brain. We can't see it. We don't know how to measure it, which doesn't make it not true. It just makes it really intangible. And I wouldn't want to lump it in as one way to detect or diagnose ADHD. And there's a lot of different thinking around it. However, what is true, what we do see in the brain and what we do know is measurable, is that the amygdala, for people with ADHD, the amygdala tends to have a bigger reaction to negative emotion and positive emotion. So the amygdala, which is where the feeling is experienced, has this way bigger than normal, I shouldn't say way, but a significantly measurably bigger reaction to strong negative and strong positive feelings, emotions, and that the cognitive part of the brain that actually regulates the thinking, that there's a delay. It's almost like if you could imagine the amygdala explodes so big that the thinking has no room to think. It takes up all the energy, all the space. People with ADHD have a gap before they're able to bring their thinking in line with the emotion, which gives the emotion more time to affect the thinking. So you and I both know that if you ask me right now, like, how do I feel about American politics or like whatever, if I'm not feeling a whole bunch of emotion right now, I can probably give you a pretty logical explanation, right? I would say, I don't agree with this. And I can just explain to you my thinking around why I so disagree with certain political things or whatever. But if I'm charged, if I have just been with a client who can't get an abortion in the States because she's in a fucking state that won't let her, and I am in a state where I'm like so worked up emotionally, Now ask me how I feel about American politics. I am going to have a different answer. My thinking is going to be different. Not just a different tone or a different charge to it, but my actual thinking is going to be different. I may insert things in there that are not aligned with my values, right? I may say things that it's outside of my values, but I'm so emotional that my thinking is affected by that emotion. So I think we can all relate to that, right? That is the experience, the human experience of it. For people with ADHD, this is happening more often. So I see it a lot in people who can't present well. They're brilliant. They have like they have all the information. They're brilliant. But when they get the emotions that go along with whatever their particular emotional fear is or whatever, it stops them from being able to have the thoughts that are going to be able to give them access to their presentation or whatever. It happens all the time in people who are in tricky relationships where the relationship is triggering them into these big emotions and then they say things that they later regret or they don't mean or whatever. So, what's interesting about this particular part about ADHD is that, of course, there are people who are we haven't really talked much about masking, but it's very common sense. You don't really need me to talk a lot about it to understand what masking is. We know what masking is. It's when you compensate for all of these things, right? So especially as girls, we were brought up in families where you didn't behave certain ways, and a lot of parents are very good at forcing their children to behave certain ways, and the fear of consequence or whatever can be enough so that people really learn how to condition their responses, right? So even though my feelings I completely relate with the whole ADHD. The feelings get so big so fast, and it does affect the thinking. There is a lot of conditioning there, and I'm still going to say the polite thing or the appropriate thing or whatever. But a lot of people don't have that. A lot of people really get themselves into deep trouble because of that inability. So, this is where coaching is really good. What would happen if you went on medication? So, same thing where I was looking for, is this true? Are we actually seeing this? And we are seeing this. So, essentially, you're not getting the big spike in the amygdala, which gives people a much better shot at actually saying what they think, not being hijacked by that emotion. When people go on the ADHD medication, that becomes available to them. So a lot of people will describe when they're on the medication, they can finally express themselves like a sane person. These are people that have really been suffering because of this. And then they go on the medication and they realize, so they'll say, when my husband does this, I used to whatever. Now, when he does it, I just calmly say to him, listen, that's not okay. It's not going to work for me. That is tremendously helpful. But everyone has their own decision to make about medication. That said, I think there are situations probably where it's so extreme for people, the suffering is so much that the medication should be something that they try to see what happens. And then what's beautiful about coaching is because it actually gives you that opportunity to experience it differently, you may be able to actually affect some of the environmental conditioning that could create that sort of change, right? So what you can do without medication, but things like learning how to just be aware of that happening, also using thinking strategies. So you have to accept that the firing, that big loud firing, it's not a weakness. It's just the way that you're wired. If you can actually get some coaching, you could effectively put in some thinking strategies that actually go along with those big emotions that can adapt the thinking to be much more effective what you want to experience. Okay, so it's 9 o'clock. Really quickly, the difference between what to accept and what to change. There's more of these, and I think it's very useful. I will put them into a format that is going to be really comprehensive and really succinct in terms of what's going on in the brain. What do people have to accept that is very difficult, if not impossible, to change? And what can change, and how might one change it? I want to boil it down to be that simple so that it becomes a really good guide for people to be able to work around. And then the intangible part about it, how we feel about all of this stuff, is the work that essentially we're already doing as NLP coaches, which is like all the shame around having been late your whole life. There's so many different ways to work with the emotions. You guys have heard me talk about meta emotions, right? Emotions that we have about our emotions. In my own practice, I was noticing that the emotion people were having was rarely inappropriate or unwarranted. It was the emotion they had about having the emotion that was inappropriate. So they would feel embarrassed, which wasn't a problem. And it would be okay to just have embarrassment, let it move through, respond accordingly. But then they would have shame about the embarrassment. So the emotions that people have about the emotions are actually the ones that are really problematic. And I think a lot of what has to happen in terms of getting a much better understanding is recognizing what we have historically done to ourselves because of these wired in things, and remove anything that has to do with fault or blame if it could just be extracted entirely. This is what's happening. This is why it's happening, and this is what you can do about it. And I think it really opens things up for us in terms of how to actually go about it.